So I have the pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Fallon Samuels Aidoo. I met Fallon for the first time in 2019 at a conference in South Carolina, and I heard about her work on Martha's Vineyard, and I thought, we have got to get her to Nantucket to share these stories. And so 3 years and a pandemic later, here we are. So, Dr. Fallon Samuels Aidoo, founding principal of Studio RXP, and a professor at Tulane University School of Architecture, analyzes hazards to heritage and adapts heritage to hazards. Her work within academia and professional practice revolves around rehabilitation, revitalization, and recovery of real estate impacted both chronically and acutely by distress, deterioration, disinvestment, and disasters. These inquiries focus on marginalized and minoritized historic sites, structures, and streetscapes significant to Black, Indigenous, and immigrant histories on the Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf Coast. Her coastal research currently involves partnership with oral historians, archaeologists, cartographers, city planners, and community stewards in New England and New Orleans, such as the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard. Fallon has contributed to publications and projects of architectural retrofit, landscape rehabilitation, inclusionary preservation, and disaster management for cultural heritage in Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Tulsa, and San Antonio. Dr. Aidoo holds degrees in urban planning from Harvard, architectural history from MIT, and civil structural engineering from Columbia, as well as a GIS certificate from Harvard. She meets the U.S. Secretary of the Interior standards for architectural historians engaged in historic preservation and the requirements for AICP certification from the American Planning Association. Please help me welcome Dr. Fallon Samuels Aidoo.
Thank you all you can all hear me, I hope, for being here and for welcoming me here to the island. This is my first time here in Nantucket, even though I've been at the other island many, many times. And I'm glad to finally see the connections between here and there and expand my work and my understanding of what the Atlantic world is and has been. Let's see, this started. All right. So I'm between positions, so it may be a little bit confusing, but I previously held the position of Jane Babel, Professor of Historic Preservation at the University of New Orleans, and I'm staying in New Orleans, but joining the faculty at Tulane as of next week. And part of my interest in being here with you all in Nantucket this week in particular, despite all that's going on, is that we're on the kind of back end of Juneteenth weekend, and I spent Sunday at Dunmere by the Sea. It's one of a handful of sites on Martha's Vineyard listed in the Green Book, which, if you don't know, was a kind of traveler's guide for people of color that kind of helped them find safe passage and safe places to stay during, in particular, the Jim Crow era, but even long thereafter, because it wasn't just kind of shut off. The valve wasn't just shut off or shut on for there to be places for you to stay overnight, whether you were vacationing or just traveling to see family. And this structure here that was named Dunmere by the Sea by its owners, the McBride brothers from Harlem in the 1960s, has a older history, obviously, if you can tell by its architecture. It's not a structure built in the 1960s. And that's part of what, for me, this past weekend has been about. Even though I was visiting with family, it was about understanding the complexities and somewhat contradictions of any one structure at one time. And so this particular structure, built in 1880 on Circuit Avenue in Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard, was moved to this site closer to the harbor, Oak Bluffs Harbor, and these kinds of moves are the things that are most interesting to me, even though the architecture is beautiful, and as is the siting. Being in the presence of these structures and their histories make me question, well, why was it moved? Was it because Circuit Avenue diversified in its residency at that very time that it was moved in 1910? Was it about the siting that it ultimately had on Pennacook, which is in the Copeland Plan Historic District of Oak Bluffs? There's many, many stories that could be told, and they can't all be told by the structure themselves. Sometimes it's about the lot siting, sometimes it's about a much broader landscape in which it sits. And so sitting there on the porch of Dunmere Cottage, I was looking out over the harbor into Inkwell Beach. The Inkwell is the kind of colloquial name for a town beach that was the kind of acceptable place for people of color to access the beach in Oak Bluffs. And it's literally, half a block from that structure. But that's also a beach that has not always been that kind of place for people. And so that too is a very complicated story. And these complicated and somewhat contradictory narratives are the kinds of narratives I get to construct. I have the privilege of constructing, not on my own or in the bubble of the Ivy Tower, but rather in community and through engagement with people who are stewarding these sites and those who are actively building a constituency of people who are invested in expanding the narratives of those stories. I don't presume to know or be able to research all that there is to tell, and I expect that there are others who can add to those narratives. And so I have had the privilege of working for the past couple of years with the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard, which is about as old as the Nantucket Preservation Trust, but is a much smaller organization that does not own any historic assets, but rather places historical markers on sites and structures around the island, and is largely run by some very enterprising, sprightly women, and has some amazing people who serve on the board as well. The tour guides, however, are as diverse as the population of Martha's Vineyard, and that's really made it possible for the organization to come to know of a diverse history of the island. And in the course of that work, they have engaged and met people like myself who can even further expand what they know and what they can share with people who take their tours. And so Dunmere was the 34th site added to the trail, and I'm, of course, actively involved with them being able to build the capacity to not just do a placing of a marker here and there, but a development of preservation ordinances and districts around those very sites that they have already set markers for. These sites stretch across the island of Martha's Vineyard and reflect the diversity of the island's population now, but particularly its population at the height of the development of the Atlantic world as a space in which Black peoples of various places were constantly being moved by force and through fugitivity. And that means that the sites throughout Martha's Vineyard reflect enslavement, emancipation, abolition, as well as escape and people kind of, what do you call that word? Being protected in a variety of ways. But not just that kind of 18th, 19th century stories of that, but also joy and recreation and leisure. These are also part of how people and why people were moving through the kind of maritime landscape and the island, the land masses therein. Excuse me. Because the people who move to the island now have a lot of public profiles that suggest to the broader public that this is a place of privilege and a place where there is endless resources to finance preservation work, to fund historical research. It's been rather challenging for the Heritage Trail Organization and researchers of heritage to identify funding partners, quite frankly, for the kind of work that needs to be done to tell the kind of stories that the Black Atlantic world requires. And one of the things that's really striking is the degree to which all of the sites on the African American Heritage Trail of Martha's Vineyard are only on that listing except for two, on that kind of registry, so to speak, except for two. Two, as of last year, were added to the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom kind of portfolio. But beyond that, not a single one of the other sites or structures is on the National Register of Historic Places. And the dedication of the 35th site, this coming Friday, I guess that's tomorrow, is the first on an existing NRHP, just to keep things short, site on the island, and that is the Camp Meeting Association's Campgrounds, which is a National Historic Landmark. So that will be the first site that actually has a plaque, and these two things kind of coming into connection with each other. One might say, well, that's not in and of itself a problem, except that the inclusion of these sites on the National Register often is the kind of impetus for the documentation that allows for local authorities and state authorities who may not be historical commissions, they may just be the planning board or the hazard mitigation planner, for them to be able to understand what resources exist within the spaces that they are managing. And so that lack of documentation has really affected what's happening to the resources on the vineyard. You have many sites that are kind of subject to demolition and development threats, mainly because there isn't an understanding or knowledge of the site's history, not because people are just kind of brazen developers. More importantly, that heritage is not something that floodplain managers and coastal planners and disaster recovery and preparedness policymakers, that they have to take into account when they are applying the, hopefully, more federal resources to address climate change and natural hazards. And so if those of you who aren't familiar, there is a trigger that happens in the execution of federal funds for, let's say, disaster response and recovery. If your site is or property is listed on the National Register, there's a certain amount of surveying that is required by those who are using those funds, and mitigation that they're at least required to outline, if not actually perform, and to protect that resource that is listed. Well, if it's not listed, you're off the hook. And so one of the things that I am doing with the Heritage Trail is to ensure that those sites that are already recognized are part of this other registry as well, but that there's a number of sites that are not on the Heritage Trail that warrant inclusion in the National Register, even if they don't get a plaque, a Heritage Trail plaque. And that is a thankless job, quite frankly. There's an entire island of heritage and historic resources, and so how does one, focus one's time and energies and resources? One thing that helped to kind of narrow this field was the pandemic. The pandemic, as you all here in Nantucket would be quite aware, stressed property owners that are also operators of businesses that revolve around the property itself. So inns and in-house catering and so many other kind of what's called cottage businesses in economic language. These business operators and property owners were the focus of our dialogue series over the pandemic and provided, quite frankly, a fountain of new knowledge about the properties themselves, not just the businesses. And so there's approaching this question of where to begin based on what's the most urgent kind of challenge that's being faced by the community of people who are in some way connected to heritage, and that was kind of the impacts of COVID and the pandemic on these small businesses. And so from that, we've started building stories, and through an application, GIS-based application, that allows us to geographically relate these stories to each other, ultimately. So this is a work in progress. But the story of Shara Cottage, was speaking previously with this past February with the descendant of the original owners, African-American owners of Shara Cottage. It's the longest running inn on Martha's Vineyard, period. And it is been running, the only time that they did not run was during the pandemic, 1 year during the pandemic, and this year to renovate. It was started by a couple, one Native American and one African American, and being able to connect their story of yesteryear to their story now of moving through current development review processes and wastewater management regulations is a critical part of being able to understand these complexities of the Black Atlantic now and of the past. But it's not just these direct engagements that need to be done. The work that we're doing on the ground also needs to be connected to the work that's being done elsewhere. And that's mainly been happening in scholarly books, which, as a scholar myself, I too will be writing at some point. But there are other ways in which these stories get connected to one another. One of them is a symposium like this, where we have people who are doing this work from New York to Rhode Island. Another is, the people that you meet when you're actually conducting the research because you happen to be at the same archive, using the same sources. However, when your sources are in the attic of just a very dedicated steward, you rarely come across those individuals. And when the resources needed to tell stories about people of color are rarely in your typical public records repositories, your court records, your plan books, there's fewer and fewer instances where you get to connect the dots with people and with those sites and stories. And I just want to pause for a moment to say that one of the largest challenges in writing more complex and inclusive histories of any place, but particularly of property, is the degree to which property has intentionally been documented only to support the largely white and affluent population of the United States. So speaking within the confines of the United States. And so there are very, very few records even of, let's say, leasing lots. A lot of places, especially in coastal regions, you didn't purchase lots, you leased them. And if you didn't have the resources to purchase the properties. And that goes across races. And so those leasing ledgers are very hard to come by. And and even when you do, you don't necessarily have records for the people who were allowed to stay, but really that was, out of circumstance, not because they actually wanted them to be a part of the community. And so there's the Sharer Cottage, for instance, is in an unincorporated part of Oak Bluffs to this day. The roads are not part of the city road structure. So if you try on Google Maps to do the Google Street View and put the little orange person on the street that Sharer Cottage is on, you will not be able to do so. Not because Google hasn't tried to put a car through the Highlands, but because the street doesn't exist as far as the street grid is concerned. And so that affects the kinds of stories you can tell and who gets to tell them. And perhaps most challenging is that our community of preservationists have, in many cases, not incorporated our insights into the wider demographics and narratives into the very codified documentation that we use within our profession. And so nomination forms for the various National Park Service designations have almost about, I think the number is about 2%. Currently, the research shows reflects the histories of African American populations anywhere in the United States. And so that's not because you can't include that in the narrative structure of the nominations, but that it has yet to be normalized as what's needed. The same goes for historic tax credits rolls, where you have the data that the federal government and the state government keep on applications, eligibility determinations, the people who actually make it through that three-step process that I know is very, very arduous to get to tax credits. Tax credits require tax liability. So if you're not making a profit off of the income generated by a property, you don't have tax liability, and thus a tax credit is of no value. And in order for your property to be an income-generating property, you must be operating some type of enterprise. And for many property owners, this is just generally, that's not what the function of their home is, but more particularly for a homestead that serves as a place of memory and communion amongst people within your family and those in your extended family, that's not the function of the property. And so there's an underrepresentation of places that would be eligible for the tax credits in those tax rolls for that reason. And so I want to pivot here to where all these things kind of come together. So I've thrown out a lot of different ways in which telling these complex stories and constructing them is done nowadays, and where is that actually happening, and under what circumstances. Martha's Vineyard has one National Historic Landmark, and that is the Campgrounds. These pretty gingerbread cottages seen on postcards are a part of the Campgrounds. And it's pretty reflective of preservation in the 1970s, nationally, but particularly in these coastal towns and regions, where the architecture itself and its connection to the whaling era of settlement and the kind of immediate thereafter, who kind of came to the island once the whaling industry kind of died down. That is the primary historical narrative attached to these houses, even though this particular landscape is connected to kind of religious encampment on the Martha's Vineyard. Quite frankly, they could have come just to be in reunion with each other, and the houses could have looked just the same, maybe less ecclesiastical window structures, but the broader geography and construction materiality of these houses would have been largely the same. And so that is the defining narrative that was the reason for the NHL, and thus the period of significance ends in 1901, when the campgrounds had kind of reached its limits in terms of new lots to lease to potential owners and builders of these cottages. There were a number of structures built in the campgrounds by 1901 that were already in the process of being removed by the Camp Meeting Association itself. As there was reaching its capacity, there was an interest amongst some, definitely not all, some of its membership to expel those deemed to be, the people deemed to be kind of not worthy of being a part of the community, but also the structures considered to be not up to par with the other structures. And that started in 1898, according to the board minutes for the Camp Meeting Association. And if you cross-reference those individuals that were expelled and whose cottages were removed, you find a not so coincidental overpopulation of people of color in that set of individuals. That in and of itself was eye-opening, because for many people who know anything about the Vineyard, we just all assumed nobody of color ever lived in the campgrounds. It was kind of, the campgrounds was a kind of, we just figured it was deed restricted to be exclusively white. But in fact, it was a much more diverse residential seasonal community before these expulsions, starting just before the turn of the 20th century. And so that set of structures that existed then were mapped in Sanborn maps in 1887, and they were all concentrated on one street or so within the campgrounds. And the ones in blue here are those that were moved to another lot still within the campgrounds, kind of boundaries, which extend to your right across Dukes County Avenue in Oak Bluffs. And so the period of significance of 1901, that being the cutoff, and these structures being moved between 1901 and 1910, means that we don't actually capture in the NHL nomination that exists on the record the fact that these structures were not just moved, but there was a concerted effort to displace them. And that is a part of the history of this landmark, not just something extraneous to it, which then raises these questions. Well, does it contribute to the character of this place? And that's a tricky term, character, right? Are we talking about architectural character? But most people would think more holistically, the character of the campgrounds as a place of communion in the summer, people from all over the place. And there's a lot of pushback against assigning contributing status to structures that were effectively expelled from the campgrounds and during its period of significance and thereafter. However, there is growing interest amongst the leadership of the Camp Meetings Association currently to revise this nomination and address the fact that the history is kind of truncated on this point. But there's another kind of matter, I think, at issue here, which is less about displacement and movement within the Camp Meeting Association's own boundaries and how that can affect what kind of stories we tell about that historic landmark, but the fact that not all of them were moved within the campgrounds. There was a selection even there. There was curation of which could be recited within the campgrounds and which had to go all the way out the side of the boundaries altogether. And so there's only a few that were recited or relocated within the campgrounds. Some of the largest structures, some that had undergone renovations just prior to that, 1898 meeting about their relocation. And the others, where did they go? Were they relocated? Did they relocate their own structures? Were they removed by the Camp Meeting Association? Were they demolished? Was the structure deconstructed so that they can be rebuilt someplace else? Or were the cottages sold wholesale to someone else? So one that made it to that other side of the street within the Camp Meeting Association's boundaries, on the bottom left, Harriet Peck's house. That house is still standing today. You can visit it. It's not a living museum or anything. People live there. The others that are pictured here, we believe were actually relocated down further on Dukes County Avenue, but that is a current ongoing project of investigation. On the bottom right, you have the Howard University Singers, and the top right, a group of people that we're yet to identify. And so those expelled from the campgrounds were experiencing what we might call today kind of reverse redlining, in that you were unable to get loans in that area, entire area in red, if you wanted to finance construction of a cottage. You were also unable to be leased a lot in that area, and you were unable to be sold a lot in that area. Not because people of color lived there, but quite the opposite, because those who already were kind of members of the associations that own those properties, kind of like a homeowners association or co-op board of today, had already kind of defined the rules of living in those areas, and thus it was off limits. At that time, everything in black were your only other developed lots, so lots that had been platted already and taxable by the town of Oak Bluffs. So your options were rather limited on this island at that time in terms of where to go. There was new subdivisions being planned like gangbusters. The town of Oak Bluffs was, if you were a private developer, this was the place to be, and they were granting large tracts of lots to a lot of developers. And so we don't yet know enough about the accessibility of those lots. We have found some deeds from some of them that explicitly indicate no Jewish people, no Catholics, no people of, specifically people who are Portuguese speaking, because that was a large part of the population on the island. So there's certainly, in a non-systematic way at this juncture, some effort to create a colored section of Oak Bluffs. What is a consequence of all of this? Removal and, frankly, no other term better, racism, for those who were already settled in the town of Oak Bluffs in the early 20th century. So the campgrounds is largely a seasonal community. The structures that I showed you earlier were not winterized, and thus they were, if you chose to live there during the, winter seasons, you were doing so at your own peril. Many of the cottages are still not winterized today. That's how people choose to use them. But there was a long-term, year-round population that dates well before that kind of 1988 time stamp, in fact, by that time, enough people were living year-round that that's the date in which this church, Bradley Memorial Church, was constructed to serve both African Americans, Native Americans, and Luso Americans, meaning people from Portugal, Portuguese colonized islands, particularly the Azores and Cape Verde. And so for the people who were living here full-time here, not Nantucket here, but living on the Vineyard full-time circa 1900, 1910, looking for a place to set down roots in this area, in walkable distance from this church that they had, this congregation that they had built. Like I said, the options were fairly limited, and so this area in blue is somewhat kind of our approximation of the colored district, the colored section of Oak Bluffs. It's underrepresented in Sanborn maps, so there's whole stretches of land that do not have any structures on the map, Sanborn maps, but you can walk those blocks today, and there are absolutely 19th century structures there. And so there was some very shoddy documentation that we rely upon for preservation work that we're trying to rectify through our own surveying. But we're also doing that with the help of the family members who have stayed in this area throughout the entire 20th century. And one of those is the Denistons, who were the family who became the church leadership of this church in its second iteration. So when it first formed in the early 1800s by a kind of a Methodist association, it was typical where a kind of white Methodist, evangelical would come to some region and build a church specifically for the people of color in that area. And then once there was someone of that area they felt they can pass it on to, leadership onto, they did so. And that, in this case, was Oscar Deniston. His family, multiple generations of his family, lived in the church property itself, and then subsequently built out somewhat of a campus of properties that supported the mission of the church, which over its duration, somewhat kind of trickling off after World War II, was to serve a migrant immigrant population. And so that included boarding houses. And so there's a number of properties that were purchased by members of the Denison family, but they were all purchased within this section. And even though there were, for a family like the Denistons that had been there for nearly a century at this point, they could afford to purchase property in other parts of the island, but they did not. And what I find is a really interesting little tidbit is that in 1929, Oscar Deniston signed a mortgage with Martha's Vineyard National Bank. The mortgage was not discharged by his death, and in 1950, it was assigned to his son and daughter, and so it was still in the hands of one of those children, Olive, in 2006. So it tells you a little bit about how the lending, even when you could find a property and you could buy a property in this section, the kind of financing that you could get to develop these on these lots was, I wouldn't call it predatory per se. I don't have enough research to make that kind of claim. But it was designed for the properties to continuously be mortgaged in some capacity, and for the banks to have a stake in the development of this area going forward. So I just want to note that these properties that they did develop for boarding houses, those structures no longer exist. And even though there's been a concerted effort in the past 10 plus years to kind of revitalize what was colloquially called Bradley Square. The NAACP was a big driver, the NAACP's chapter in Martha's Vineyard was a big driver of re-establishing the placeness of Bradley Square amongst people who live on the island now, not as a colored section, so much as a place in which colored people built community with each other and developed a sense of ownership and settlement and rootedness. And so these structures encircling Bradley Memorial Church here have been kind of one by one over the past 5 years undergoing demolition. The church itself is also gone as of 2019. The house across the street as of 2021. And so we have to ask ourselves as, excuse me, as preservationists, how does such a significant set of structures get demolished? And there are a number of possible answers to the question. The one that's most frequently brought up is neglect. Because that structure, built in 1898, was in disrepair. And so it demolished by neglect, just the course of speculative development. This area that was once Bradley Square is now colloquially and officially called the Arts District. And so there's questions around whether that is a driver of the real estate changes happening. And lastly, this kind of where Bradley Memorial Church is located is it's about 3 feet above an elevation, the block before it, which is also about 3 feet above the elevation of the block before it, as you traveling back towards the harbor. So there is a incentive on the part of developers to acquire properties up by the church to avoid the progressive and, good intentioned taxing that's happening of properties closer to the harbor that are within the coastal plain. And so this is, one could call it climate change gentrification, or you can just call it managed retreat from the shoreline and the effects of that on heritage kind of within highlands, whether it's the Vineyard Highlands officially as an area or just higher ground. But that is certainly a possible answer as well. Additionally, there was another church that served the other kind of section of African American settlement it's maybe walking distance to us now or then, but it's certainly a separate section, the Vineyard Highlands, and at the center of it was Baptist Temple Park. That structure too is demolished, and it is the lot in which it was located, East Chop Association, which is the largest landowner on the island of Martha's Vineyard. They can't quite tell you the story of how the structure disappeared. So there's a lot of question marks whether there is an effort to make these structures disappear much more systematically. Again, these are not necessarily the actual historical facts so much as the optics of what happens when heritage of such significance just goes away, even despite it having such value to the current population, not just a population that's bygone. I'd like to just add to this, these sets of speculations, a few things. There is, the kind of 100-year storm that looms over the Vineyard and, quite frankly, Nantucket, that could, wipe away all of this heritage, but there's also the perfect storm, and that needs to be paid attention to. And in this particular case, Bradley Memorial Church and the collection of properties around it, both the ones owned by the Denistons and those that we believe were moved up Dukes County Avenue from the campgrounds, are located on what you would consider today to be oversized, what the planning board considers to be oversized lots. And, so you have a structure here, top right. This structure could be, we could put 5 of these on that same lot. And so you have very large lots within a 10-minute walk of Oak Bluffs Harbor. And that is certainly an incentive for a developer. You have lot coverage allowances grandfathered in. Here, there's a lot of grandfathering in as well for properties from pre-1972, as I've learned. The same goes for the Vineyard. There are a number of kind of 20th century zoning prescriptions that are not applicable to 19th century lots. Then you add to it that there's low to no demand for these particular structures, right? These structures were built to house migrant and immigrant families. They were built more as boarding houses than they were as, kind of individual family, single family residences. So while they may have a ton of room for you to do whatever you would like from a renovation perspective, it takes quite a bit of money to make those renovations actually work. And what I forgot to add here was that much of them are on septic and not sewered. And then the big kahuna is that when you have families that have done all that they can to hold on to these properties and maintain them, you have very complicated title and very complicated financial obligations. So you may have multiple mortgages and multiple family ownership of the same property. And so, for example, the church property that the Denisons held, they had brought in another family to share the ownership of that property to help maintain it in the kind of post-World War II years. So it took 3 years to clear title for this when the property was ultimately sold. That all sounds very doom and gloom, but there's a glimmer of hope here that I want to leave you all with, and that is that the kind of savior, so to speak, in this whole scenario, and one that I think warrants more investigation, is that the Affordable Housing Trust for the Martha's Vineyard stepped in as that third kind of, as an institutional investor in the properties that the Denisons own. They commissioned a plan for how to redevelop the land and a means by which to transfer the properties into their ownership and for them to hold it in trust. And so while many oppose this transfer, kind of the broader public, because why would you buy a property that's with a building in such poor condition, and the foundation and the framing, everything about it, you can't even move the structure. What's the point of spending hard-fought affordable housing funds on this property? And to be fair, they had a point. This was all that the Affordable Housing Trust had to work with. And thus, they did ultimately have to sell the property themselves. They needed to, the order of this. They bought the land in 1905 and proposed to create more affordable housing for current population, some commercial space, as well as restoring the existing historic building for community use. They received the local and regional approvals for the plan and raised $1.3 million to make it happen. But the recession happened, and they ultimately needed to kind of come due on their financing to purchase the Denison property. So although they had all these resources, they too needed financing, and the terms were not so favorable that they were able to come through the recession unscathed. And so their only recourse from a fiduciary perspective was to list the lots as vacant. And so they got the demolition permits approved. They went through that process, and they were ultimately sold it to essentially a neighbor of the property, who owns neighboring properties. But as a result of this whole set of transactions, the Affordable Housing Trust became inactive. It had essentially expended all of its resources. And it took an influx of cash to kind of revitalize it several years later. The person who purchased it does not have an interest in preserving the history of the site. He's allowing the Heritage Trail to place a plaque on it, but he's not, one would say, a part of the preservation community, officially or otherwise. I think it was interesting. He says, I might make a bigger garden when I have a clean slate, but I'll start thinking about the design of what I do then. And so there were two sets of entities that could have really made a difference here that I think offer a lesson here, which is that affordable housing trusts and others institutional entities that step in, whether it's a preservation trust, I think have absolutely the right intentions in mind, but often would work better if they were working in concert with other entities, public and nonprofit. And in this case, the regional, the Martha's Vineyard Commission does a review of development they consider of regional impact. Excuse me. And that, while the plans kind of sailed through their review process because it met all the triggers and everything was kind of formally on the up and up, the commission often functions as an aggregator of other entities that could bear on the outcome of this particular development. For instance, Share Cottage went through the review process just this past year, and the commission was key to ensuring that the property made it through the wastewater review locally. But this is, the commission in this particular case abdicated its responsibilities towards this particular property. In fact, asking an entity that has no bearing on the case, the Massachusetts Historical Commission, which then kicked it back to them. They're like, we don't have bearing on local matters. This is really up to you to make this decision and handle this process. And so there are another more local set of actors and stakeholders, like the Oak Bluffs Historical Commission, that also could have been more of a steward of the process and of the property. They tend not to step into planning and policy making, but they did say that this should be preferably preserved in this case, but that language is not strong enough when you're working against the tide of preservation history. And so there's just much more of a responsibility on the part of local and regional actors to be invested in properties that have a very complicated history and a very complex set of contemporary issues. And so that set of actors, they were there, and they could have done more, which means to me that there's the potential for that to happen again. I'm more of a glass half full kind of person, and so if you can bring the governor and all the other major political actors out to the site to break ground once you've raised the funds, you've generated enough political will. You actually need to then kind of follow through and ensure that will is concentrated to where it most matters. And that's to ensuring that everyone involved understands that this is not every other historic property. You need to chart new routes to its preservation and shepherd it, quite frankly, through processes that are designed to ensure its erasure. And so the great thing is that no one would be doing this work alone now compared to 5 years ago. There is an immense groundswell, just as there are groundbreakings happening, to support local historical associations and preservation communities in making inclusivity and equity and justice the kind of driving force behind the work that they do. And the big institutional funders in preservation are joining in this work. And I encourage any of you in this room and online to take advantage of the National Park Service's new programs. I mean, there are lots of new programs, and yes, it's gonna take a while to understand how they work, but I really implore you all to do so, because it's through the use of these programs that there will be a community of people who are versed in the work that we're doing. And this is work that, whether it's professionally or academically, that requires all hands on deck. So I thank you so much for hearing me out.
We're going to have time for question and answer. We have about 15 minutes, so if anyone has questions for Fallon. Okay.
Just a simple question. Does this have to be structures either existing or not, or can it just be a place of significance? I mean, I'm not so sure whether historic preservation is all just about physical entities as opposed to stories.
That's a great question. And, you know, I debated, in fact, focusing all of my time on a structure, especially a structure that no longer exists, and now it is the land. To me, no, there's no limitations to this kind of work being done for landscapes or even just kind of senses of place. So I was able to attend the dedication, the Heritage Trail dedication, for a plaque on Edgartown Wharf, where there was a Wampanoag Indian had saved an African woman enslaved on a maritime vessel that was coming into or leaving the port, I forget which one, and that particular act was the impetus for a kind of settlement and community, not really a settlement, a community of Wampanoag African people in Aquinnah, as well as in Edgartown. And the plaque is there just to commemorate what took place presumably on the water. And so there isn't actually even a land site that is associated with it, but that plaque and where it sits is elevated on the wharf such that when you have the water vista and you're able to kind of take in where and how people came into this island and left it, perhaps still enslaved. And so I don't see these acts of preservation or these movements on the part of local kind of stewards and advocates to be bound by knowing the location exactly or having access even to the land and the site. If you can craft the story based on his research, then you can tell that story where it's best received.
Hang on one minute.
I just think here we have a lot of stories that are yeah, you don't have a direct connection, and it's great that they can receive the same treatment.
And, one of the things that, in a lot of this, the challenge of working on the histories of property and people who've been moved and written out of the records, is that the real task is to create space for the remembrance and for the retelling. Now, that space can be a structure, it can be a physical site, but it can also be something much more intangible, like an annual commemoration. There are a colleague of mine has done work on the Purple Pea Festival in Texas, and how that is itself a means of recreating the space for that remembrance, even though the site of the festival changes each year, and even who attends changes. So there are a number of ways. I think that this is going to become even more important as we move into the 20th century more with preservation work, and we finally start including in periods of significance the slum clearance and urban renewal eras, and those streets no longer exist anymore, and there's a real challenge on at our feet to be more creative about how we construct spaces for preservation conversations to happen, not just how we kind of protect already constructed spaces.
Other questions?
I just wanted to add to what you said. I live in New York part-time, most of the time here. And there is a plaque a block from my home commemorating Nathan Hale, who was hanged in the area. They don't know exactly where, but it was in that area. And there's a plaque attached to what is now a privately owned building that commemorates Nathan Hale and what he did during the Revolutionary War. So it's an example of commemorating an event and a person in an area where they don't know exactly where the hanging took place. But I think those sorts of things are important for our history.
I absolutely loved your presentation. I kind of come at it from a different way, a preservationist in Fairfield County. I say fight like hell for the last remaining structures that are there. Well, I'm familiar with the fight in Little Iberia and Bridgeport. It's a building that is literally overwhelmed by buildings around it. And we may lose that fight, but I think where you still have structures, you gotta fight like hell. Because it's a place to go and see, and if someone puts a gas station on it, it makes it not a great tourist place at that point in time. And you would like to have places that drive stories that are enjoyable to go see, and not have to go and see the gas station that replaced, this wonderful house that Macy Tisdale's trying to save. Because a lot of people have worked a lot of hours to save that structure at this point in time. So I come from the fight like hell side of it, to keep whatever you can keep. Delay.
I definitely feel as though, for me personally, to honor the work at sweat equity in many cases done by others to preserve those spaces in whatever state they're in, whether that was the Dennison family, like that conversation that they had to have amongst themselves where they needed to open up ownership to some other family because they needed help with this property. Like there's honoring those struggles and the decisions that people make, whether in hardship and otherwise, to protect histories, to protect places for people to experience those histories being felt. And that's personally why I'm invested in the kind of built environment to honor that. But at the same time, not everyone can save things. And so that doesn't mean that it's not still worth my effort to make a means by which that we can remember what came before.
Speaking to that, do you see anything increasing on the national level that would assist homeowners? I understand the historic tax credit portion of it. It's very laborious to go through. And obviously, if you don't have an income-producing property, it's kind of not necessarily worth it. But we're losing so many things because the expense of preservation is just so great. And so on the national level, is there anything coming out that would benefit the smaller projects versus, the giant commercial, mills that are being, sucking up those tax dollars or tax credits?
So this may be the hill I die on, but I think that it's amazing that Congress has approved the National Park Service's budget to include all these new programs that recognize so many different histories and heritage. But the eligibility to apply for them is state government, county government, local government, special districts, and none of whom own that kind of property that you're talking about, the small properties that are important to telling these histories. And so even when you have a really proactive governmental official who partners with, let's say, the Preservation Trust to make that happen, it's, that's not the norm. That's not going to be something that we can count on. And so my answering your question, it exists, but the initiative has to be taken by public officials, or at least they have to be partners with those who take that initiative to get those funds. And then you have to actually create a program of distributing those funds. And so this is, to me, where the one singular structure is dependent upon preservationists being able to plan for the multitude. And so in order for the one to get the funding, not the small one, not the big commercial, amazing inn, the small one needs a plan for preservation that includes more than just that one. And if that is something that entities, whether they're nonprofit trusts or local planning authorities are doing, then there's a spigot. And in fact, there's a spigot that's being underutilized, which I fear will result in the funds being taken away by Congress. So it's partly their fault because how they design the structure of the program, but it's also on us to recognize how these things are designed and kind of work around those designs to ensure that we essentially use them up so much that they're going to give us twice as much the next year. We hope.
Fingers crossed.
A girl can dream,
Okay, I think we're moving to our next speaker. Fallon, thank you so much.